In the last months of the Second World War, as Nazi Germany crumbled and the Soviet Red Army pushed west, millions of German civilians fled for their lives. They abandoned their homes, their farms, their cities, everything they had ever known. They were heading for the Baltic coast, desperate to reach the ports where ships were waiting to evacuate them. One of those ships was a former cruise liner called the Wilhelm Gustloff. On the night of January the 30th, 1945, it became the deadliest maritime disaster in history. More than 9,000 people died in a single night. More than the Titanic, more than the Lusitania, more than the Empress of Ireland combined. And then, for almost 80 years, the story was buried. This is that story. To understand the Wilhelm Gustloff, you have to understand what it was built to be. Not a warship, not a troop transport. It was built as a cruise ship, a holiday vessel. And the organization that built it was called Kraft durch Freude, Strength Through Joy. This was the leisure arm of the Nazi Party's German Labor Front. The idea was deceptively simple. Give German workers affordable holidays, send them on cruises to Norway, let them sunbathe on decks that looked like they belonged to a luxury ocean liner, make them feel like the Reich cared about their happiness. It was propaganda wrapped in a deck chair. The Strength Through Joy program was one of the most effective tools the Nazis ever created. It offered ordinary Germans something that had previously been reserved for the wealthy. Travel, leisure, a taste of the good life. Factory workers who had never seen the sea were suddenly booking cruises. The program organized concerts, theater trips, hiking excursions, and skiing holidays. By 1938, more than 10 million Germans had participated in some form of Strength Through Joy activity. And at the heart of it all was the fleet. The Nazis commissioned a series of purpose-built cruise ships, and the first, the flagship, was the Wilhelm Gustloff. She was built at the Blohm and Voss shipyard in Hamburg, one of the most famous shipyards in the world. Her keel was laid in August of 1936. She was launched in May of 1937. More than 208 meters long, she displaced over 25,000 tons. She had a swimming pool, a promenade deck, a theater, 7 restaurants and cafes. Her cabins could accommodate nearly 1,500 passengers. She was designed to be a floating advertisement for the supposed superiority of National Socialism. Every detail was calculated. The cabins were all the same size, a deliberate rejection of the class divisions found on traditional ocean liners. On the Gustloff, the party official and the factory worker would sleep in identical rooms. This was the illusion the Nazis wanted to project, a classless society united under one leader. Originally, the ship was supposed to be named after that leader. It was going to be the Adolf Hitler. But in February 1936, a Swiss Nazi leader named Wilhelm Gustloff was assassinated in Davos, Switzerland, by a Jewish medical student named David Frankfurter. Frankfurter walked into Gustloff's home and shot him 5 times. He then walked to the local police station and surrendered, telling them he had just killed the leader of the Swiss Nazi Party. The assassination became an international incident. Hitler was furious. He traveled to Gustloff's hometown of Schwerin for the funeral. He sat next to Gustloff's widow, Hedwig, and it was there, at the memorial service, that he decided the new flagship of the Strength Through Joy fleet would not carry his own name. It would carry Wilhelm Gustloff's name instead, a martyr for the cause. Hedwig Gustloff herself christened the ship at the launch ceremony. Hitler was in attendance. So was Rudolf Hess, Hermann Goering, and Joseph Goebbels. The entire propaganda apparatus of the Nazi state was there to capture the moment. Newsreel cameras rolled, the ship slid into the water as a symbol. Strength through joy. Joy through loyalty. Loyalty through sacrifice. The message was unmistakable. For 2 years, the Wilhelm Gustloff did exactly what it was designed to do. It carried German workers on cruises around the North Sea and the Norwegian fjords. It sailed to Madeira, to Italy, to the coast of Spain. It was used as a floating polling station in April 1938, when Austrians were asked to vote on the Anschluss, the annexation of their country by Nazi Germany. The ship anchored in the Danube, and thousands of Austrians came aboard to cast their ballots in favor of joining the Reich. In less than 18 months of civilian service, the Gustloff carried over 80,000 passengers on 60 voyages. It was, by all appearances, a triumph. Then, on September the 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The cruises stopped, the swimming pool was drained, the restaurants were closed, the Wilhelm Gustloff was painted naval gray and pressed into war service. Its first wartime role was as a hospital ship. It was dispatched to the Baltic to retrieve wounded German soldiers from the campaign in Poland and later from the invasion of Norway. It made multiple trips between Oslo and German ports, its decks now lined with hospital beds instead of deck chairs. It carried thousands of wounded men back to Germany, and in those early years, it flew the distinctive white paint and red crosses of a hospital ship, protected, theoretically, by the Geneva Convention. That protection was withdrawn in late 1940. The ship was sent to the port of Gotenhafen, which had been the Polish city of Gdynia before the German occupation. There it was stripped of its hospital markings, painted gray, and turned into a floating barracks. For the next 4 years, roughly 1,000 men of the 2nd Submarine Training Division lived on board. They slept in the cabins where holidaymakers had once dreamed of fjords. They drilled on the decks where families had once posed for photographs. As the war dragged on, the Wilhelm Gustloff sat there, rusting, its engines barely used, its hull collecting barnacles in the cold Baltic water. By January 1945, the war had entered its final phase. In the east, the Soviet Red Army had launched the Vistula-Oder offensive, a massive assault that shattered German lines and sent millions of civilians fleeing westward. East Prussia, a historic German territory on the Baltic coast, was cut off. The roads were frozen solid. Temperatures dropped well below zero at night. Columns of refugees, stretching for miles, trudged through the snow toward the ports. They brought whatever they could carry: suitcases, photographs, jewelry, bread, their children. Soviet planes strafed the roads. People died in ditches, frozen where they fell. Horses collapsed, carts overturned. It was one of the largest and most desperate mass migrations in European history. Those who made it to the ports of Pillau and Gotenhofen found chaos. Pillau, a small port town, was never designed to hold so many people. By mid-January, nearly 100,000 desperate civilians were packed into its streets. They slept in warehouses, in churches, on the frozen ground. They waited for ships that might never come. The sound of Soviet artillery grew closer every day. At night, the horizon glowed orange from burning villages. The German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, knew it had to act. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the commander of the Navy, ordered the evacuation to begin. The operation was given a name, Operation Hannibal. It would become the largest seaborne evacuation in history, far bigger than the British evacuation of Dunkirk. Over 15 weeks, from late January to early May of 1945, more than 1,000 ships, cruise liners, ferries, minesweepers, fishing boats, anything that could float, would ferry almost 1 million people across the Baltic to safety in western Germany. The Wilhelm Gustloff was one of the first ships selected for the evacuation. On January the 30th, 1945, a date heavy with symbolism, the 12th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, the Gustloff prepared to leave Gotenhofen. It would be her first voyage in over 4 years, and it would be her last. The loading of the ship began early in the morning and continued for hours. The official passenger manifest, when it was closed, listed 6,050 people. But that number was a fiction. Civilians who had no paperwork kept coming. Those who had bribed their way past the guards kept coming. Those who simply pushed through in the chaos kept coming. No one was counting anymore. Years later, a German researcher named Heinz Schön, who was himself a survivor of the sinking, would painstakingly reconstruct the actual number of people on board. His research, cross-referencing multiple sources including survivor testimony and partial records, arrived at a staggering total: 173 crew members, 918 officers and men of the 2nd Submarine Training Division, 373 female naval auxiliaries known as Marine Helferinnen, young women who had served as clerks, radio operators, and support staff, 162 wounded soldiers, and 8,956 civilians. Among them, Schön estimated, were between 4,000 and 5,000 children, infants, toddlers, teenagers. The total number of souls on board the Wilhelm Gustloff that night was 10,582, on a ship designed to carry 1,500. The conditions on board were desperate. The ship was so overcrowded that people were standing in stairwells, lying in corridors, sitting on luggage in the baggage holds. The drained swimming pool became a dormitory for hundreds of women and children. The heating system was barely functioning, but with so many bodies packed together, the air inside became stifling, almost unbreathable. Passengers were told by crew members to remove their life jackets. The reasoning was that they would take up less space. Many ignored the order. They kept the life jackets on, sweating through their clothes, gripping their children's hands. At 12:30 in the afternoon, the Wilhelm Gustloff cast off from the pier at Gotenhofen. It was accompanied by 2 torpedo boats acting as escorts. But almost immediately, things started to go wrong. One of the escort vessels developed engine trouble and was forced to turn back. Then, the nearby evacuation ship, Hansa, also part of the convoy, broke down and could not proceed. That left the Gustloff with just a single escort, the torpedo boat Loa, to protect a ship carrying more than 10,000 people. On the bridge of the Gustloff, a different kind of chaos was unfolding. The ship had 4 captains, 4 men, each believing they had authority over the vessel. There was Friedrich Petersen, the ship's official peacetime captain, a 63-year-old merchant marine veteran who had not commanded a ship at sea for years. There were 2 other merchant marine captains who had come aboard with the refugees and immediately inserted themselves into the decision-making process. And there was Lieutenant Commander Wilhelm Zahn, the commander of the U-boat trainees on board. Zahn was an experienced submariner who knew the Baltic waters intimately. He understood submarine warfare. He knew how Soviet submarines operated. and when the four men gathered on the bridge to decide how to navigate the ship, their discussion quickly turned into an argument. Zahn wanted to hug the coast, stay in shallow water where submarines couldn't operate, sail without lights to make the ship harder to spot in the darkness. Peterson disagreed. He was worried about mines in the shallow coastal waters. He wanted to take the ship into deeper water where it could move faster. Speed, he argued, was the best defense. The debate went back and forth. Zahn insisted on the coastal route. Peterson insisted on the deeper channel. In the end, Peterson, as the ship's captain, had the final say. He chose the deep water route. Then, around 6 o'clock in the evening, a radio message arrived. A German minesweeper convoy was approaching from the opposite direction. To avoid a collision in the darkness, Peterson ordered the ship's navigation lights turned on. Bright red and green beacons on either side of the massive hull. A ship carrying 10,500 people lit up like a carnival on a pitch-black sea. At that same moment, a Soviet submarine was gliding through the dark waters of the Baltic. It was S-13, a Stalinets-class submarine under the command of Captain Third-Rank Alexander Marinesco. Marinesco was a fascinating and deeply flawed figure. He was 32 years old. He was one of the Soviet Navy's most successful submarine commanders, having already sunk 2 German ships earlier in the war. But he was also a man in serious trouble. Just weeks earlier, he had gone absent without leave in the Finnish port of Turku. He had met a Swedish woman and spent several days with her while his submarine waited. The Soviet military police were looking for him. He was facing a court-martial that could have ended with him in a penal battalion, which was essentially a death sentence. The only thing that could save him was a major military success. When Marinesco's lookout spotted the lights of the Gustloff on the horizon, he could hardly believe what he was seeing. A large ship, fully illuminated, moving at moderate speed. He gave the order to shadow it. For 2 hours, S-13 tracked the Gustloff through the darkness, maneuvering into a position between the ship and the shore. Marinesco wanted to attack from the landward side, where the Germans would least expect it, where the silhouette of the ship would be most visible against the lights of the coast. At around 9 o'clock in the evening, S-13 was in position. Marinesco gave the order. 4 torpedoes were loaded into the forward tubes. Each one had been prepared with a message written on its casing. One said, "For the motherland." Another said, "For Stalin." The third said, "For the Soviet people." The fourth said, "For Leningrad," a city that had suffered more than 1 million civilian deaths during the German siege, a city Marinesco knew well. The torpedoes were fired in rapid succession. One of them jammed in its tube and never launched. The other 3 ran straight and true. They struck the Gustloff on her port side at the bow, amidships, and near the stern. The first torpedo slammed into the forward section of the ship, directly beneath the crew quarters. The watertight doors in that section automatically sealed on impact under the ship's damage control system. This was designed to contain flooding. Instead, it trapped the crew inside. They would never get out. The second torpedo struck the middle of the ship, in the area where the swimming pool had been converted into a dormitory. Hundreds of the female naval auxiliaries were quartered there. The explosion tore through the space with unimaginable force. The third torpedo hit near the stern, destroying the engine room and cutting off power. The lights on board flickered and died. Emergency lighting came on briefly, casting a dim reddish glow over the chaos, then failed too. The ship was plunged into darkness. The deck was tilted almost immediately. Fires broke out below. Thick black smoke poured through the corridors. What followed was a nightmare that exceeded anything the passengers could have imagined. The decks were coated in ice from the freezing Baltic wind. As the ship listed, people slipped and slid across the angled surfaces, unable to stop themselves, slamming into bulkheads, into railings, into each other. In the stairwells, the crush of bodies became fatal. Those who fell were trampled. Those who tried to climb found the stairs tilted at impossible angles. The lifeboats were frozen to their davits. Crew members hacked at the ice with axes, trying to free them. Most of the boats could not be launched. The ship was listing too heavily. The davits designed to swing them out over the water were now tilted inward, pressing the boats against the side of the hull. One lifeboat was lowered successfully. One. Out of all the boats on board, designed to save hundreds, a single boat made it to the water. On the upper decks, thousands of people scrambled toward the high side of the ship as the list increased. They grabbed at anything that might float: deck chairs, wooden panels, pieces of furniture. Many simply jumped into the sea. The water temperature was somewhere between 1 and 4 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, the human body goes into cold shock within seconds. Uncontrolled gasping, rapid heart rate, involuntary inhalation of water. Death from hypothermia comes in somewhere between 15 and 45 minutes. For small children, it comes much faster. For infants, it comes almost instantly. The survivors who made it into the water described scenes that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. A woman named Eva Dorn, who was 19 years old and serving as a naval auxiliary, later recalled that the screaming was the worst part. Not the cold, not the darkness, The screaming. Thousands of voices crying out in the night. Children calling for their mothers. Mothers calling for their children. Men shouting orders that no one could hear. And then, very quickly, the screaming began to fade. One voice after another, falling silent in the dark water of the Baltic. Heinz Schön, the researcher who would later document the disaster, was 23 years old at the time. He was a member of the Gustloff's crew. When the torpedoes hit, he was below decks. He managed to climb up to the promenade deck and found himself in a crowd of panicked passengers. He saw a young woman holding a baby. She was standing near the railing, frozen with fear. He tried to reach her, but the crowd pushed him away. When he looked back, she was gone. In another part of the ship, a naval officer named Werner von Schmidt was trying to organize an orderly evacuation. He stood at the top of a stairwell, shouting instructions, trying to direct people toward the outside decks. But the crush was too great. People were pushing from below, desperate to get out. Those at the top were being forced over the railing. He later said it was like watching a waterfall of human bodies. The Wilhelm Gustloff sank in less than an hour. At some point in the final minutes, the ship rolled onto its side completely, its funnels hitting the water with an enormous splash. Then, with a deep groaning sound that survivors said they could feel in their chests, it slipped beneath the surface. The lights were gone. The screaming stopped. All that remained was the cold, dark Baltic Sea and the bodies of more than 9,000 people floating in it. The rescue effort was led by the torpedo boat Löwe, the Gustloff's sole remaining escort. Its captain, Lieutenant Commander Paul Prüfer, immediately began pulling survivors from the water. But the Löwe was a small ship. It could only take so many. He radioed for help, and other vessels in the area began to arrive. The torpedo boat T-36, the minesweeper M-341, a few smaller craft. Together, they combed the darkness for survivors, pulling frozen, oil-soaked bodies from the water. A total of 1,252 people were rescued alive. Among them were Heinz Schön, Eva Dorn, and Werner von Schmidt. The rest, 9,343 men, women, and children, were dead. The death toll is staggering to contemplate. 9,343 souls, more than 6 times the number who died on the Titanic, more than the Lusitania, which claimed 1,198 lives, more than the Empress of Ireland, which took 1,012, the deadliest single-ship sinking in the history of the world, and more than half of the dead, perhaps as many as 5,000, were children. And then, the disaster was buried. The Nazi regime did not announce the sinking, not a word. It was January 31st, 1945. The Red Army was barely 100 kilometers from Berlin. The war was lost, and everyone in the German High Command knew it. Broadcasting the news that a refugee ship had been sunk with 9,000 dead, on Hitler's anniversary no less, would have been catastrophic for whatever morale still existed. So the story was suppressed. No radio bulletins, no newspaper headlines, no public acknowledgement. Families who had lost loved ones on the Gustloff were given no information. They simply disappeared. After the war ended in May 1945, the silence continued, but for different reasons. For the Soviet Union, the sinking was officially classified as a legitimate military operation. The Wilhelm Gustloff was painted gray. It was carrying active military personnel, including nearly 1,000 U-boat trainees. It was armed with anti-aircraft guns. It was not flying the white flag of a hospital ship. Under the laws of war as they existed in 1945, it was a valid military target. The fact that it was also carrying 9,000 civilians, including thousands of children, was not something the victorious Soviet Union had any interest in highlighting. So the archives were closed. The records were sealed. Alexander Marinesco, the captain of S-13, did not receive the Hero of the Soviet Union award during his lifetime. His personal conduct during the war was considered too problematic. He was discharged from the Navy, struggled with alcoholism, and died in relative obscurity in 1963 at the age of 50. For post-war Germany, the sinking was wrapped up in a larger, more painful national silence. The war had ended. The concentration camps had been liberated. The scale of Nazi crimes, 6 million Jews murdered, millions more killed in occupied territories across Europe, had been exposed to the world. The German people were confronting their own collective guilt. Within that reckoning, German suffering, even the suffering of civilians, even the suffering of children became an almost impossible subject to discuss. To mourn the victims of the Gustloff was to risk being accused of trying to create a false equivalence. You are sad about 9,000 German civilians. What about the millions murdered by the regime those civilians lived under? It was a silence born not of conspiracy, but of shame, confusion, and a national psyche too wounded to hold both truths at once. And so, for decades, the wreck of the Wilhelm Gustloff lay 44 meters beneath the Baltic Sea, about 30 kilometers off the Polish coast near the town of Leba. The site was declared a war grave. Diving was prohibited. The cold, dark water preserved the hull, but slowly, inevitably, it began to deteriorate. Above the surface, hardly anyone spoke its name. The silence began to crack in the late 1990s. In 2002, the Nobel Prize-winning German author Günter Grass published his novel Crabwalk, or Im Krebsgang. The book told the story of the Wilhelm Gustloff through the eyes of a fictional survivor named Tulla Pokrivka, who gives birth to a son on the rescue boat after being pulled from the water. The novel alternates between the sinking itself and the story of Tulla's son, a young man in the present day who becomes radicalized by neo-Nazi groups that have latched onto the Gustloff as a symbol of German victimhood. Grass was navigating treacherous waters. He was trying to tell a story that had been suppressed on the left because it was seen as revisionist and appropriated on the right for precisely that reason. Crabwalk became a sensation. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies. It forced Germany to have a public conversation it had been avoiding for more than half a century. Documentaries followed. Memorials were built. In 2007, a permanent exhibition about the Gustloff and the wider Baltic evacuations opened in the German city of Greifswald. The ship's bell was recovered by divers and placed on display. The Polish government, which administers the wreck site, has maintained its status as a protected war grave. Slowly, the dead of January the 30th, 1945, began to be remembered. But the silence has left a permanent mark. Most people on Earth have heard of the Titanic. The name has become a shorthand for disaster, for hubris, for human tragedy. Almost nobody, outside of Germany and a handful of maritime history enthusiasts, has ever heard of the Wilhelm Gustloff. Think about that for a moment. The Titanic carried roughly 2,200 people. More than 1,500 died. It has been the subject of dozens of films, hundreds of books, thousands of documentaries. Its story is taught in schools. Its artifacts are displayed in museums around the world. The Wilhelm Gustloff carried more than 10,500 people. More than 9,300 died, including thousands of children. And until very recently, almost no one talked about it. It is as if the sea itself swallowed the memory along with the ship. On a freezing night in the last winter of the Second World War, a ship carrying more than 10,000 refugees, most of them civilians, most of them women and children, all of them desperate, all of them fleeing a war that was already lost, was sent to the bottom of the Baltic Sea by 3 Soviet torpedoes. 9,343 people died in the water or inside the sinking hull. They froze, they drowned, they were crushed. They were trapped behind watertight doors that had been designed to save them. They were never given a memorial service. Their families were never told what happened to them. For decades, their names were not spoken aloud. The survivors, barely 1,200 of them, carried the memory alone for the rest of their lives. Heinz Schön, who would dedicate his entire post-war life to documenting the disaster, interviewed hundreds of fellow survivors. He compiled passenger lists. He reconstructed the sequence of events minute by minute. He wrote multiple books about the Gustloff, determined that the dead would not be forgotten. He died in 2013, having spent more than 60 years ensuring that the world would eventually know what happened on that night. One of the survivors, an elderly woman interviewed for a documentary decades after the sinking, was asked what she remembered most clearly. She was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "The silence." After the screaming stopped, there was just silence and the cold and the darkness and all those people gone. The Wilhelm Gustloff was the deadliest maritime disaster in history. It took 80 years for the world to begin to notice. For the 9,000 who never made it to shore, it is long past time that the silence was broken.